In the realm of psychedelics, safety and psychological well-being take center stage. Enter Vital, our 12-month professional training delving into the diverse realms of the psychedelic landscape. Here's what Vital student and depth hypnosis practitioner Vinitha Watson, CHT, had to say about our program.
And I really started thinking about safety, psychological safety, the safety of the psyche. And when I saw Vital, I felt like there was a very clean energy around it. I felt like it was trying to convey the reality, kind of the middle path of where we are right now. And so far, I feel like that's exactly what it is. We're having conversations around ethics. We're having conversations around integration. We're having conversations around holding space. We're having conversations around our own shadow as the practitioner. I think a lot of these conversations are, no pun intended, but maybe vital to the space. And I was really heartened to see that. I have classmates from all over the world, and it's just been such a rich experience.
Are you working in psychedelics or taking steps to get involved? Lately, we've been thinking about the future of this field, the people who are going to work with psychedelics, and how they're going to show up. So we decided to ask them. Here's what we heard from people in a new survey who are working in psychedelics right now or preparing to launch their careers. 87.6% have been influenced by their own positive experiences with psychedelics. While 47% are incorporating psychedelics into an existing career, 31.6% are switching careers entirely. And not surprisingly, making money is not the goal. A staggering 98.3% of respondents indicate that making a lot of money is not their primary motivation to enter the field. If you're curious to learn more about this growing space and perhaps find your place in it, we're inviting you to download our new 24-page report, The Emerging Psychedelic Workforce. It's packed with insights on the field you won't find anywhere else, and it's completely free. You can find it in the articles section of our website at psychedelicstoday.com/article titled The Emerging Psychedelic Workforce.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here, joined by Mason Marks. Mason, how are you today?
Great. It's good to see you, Joe.
Yeah, likewise. Great to have you on the show. And you've been quite a vocal part of this whole national psychedelic conversation around legalization, consent, and much more. Can you give us a little bit of a professional academic background on yourself?
Yeah, I'm a law professor. So I'm a full-time law professor at Florida State University College of Law. I'm also a senior fellow and the project lead on the project on Psychedelics Law and Regulation, or POPLAR, at the Petrie-Flom Center at Harvard Law School.
Beautiful, beautiful. And how did this psychedelic topic come on your radar?
I became interested when I was in law school. I went to medical school before law school, though, and that sort of set the stage for my interest because I was very interested in neuroscience and psychiatry, possibly considering psychiatry as a field. But I had a pretty frustrating experience when I worked in the hospital during a clinical rotation, a 6-week clinical rotation in a suburb of Boston. And I found that the field, there are great psychiatrists out there. It's a really important profession, so I don't mean to diminish that in any way. But in many ways, I found that it wasn't quite as compassionate as I expected. I was frustrated by the lack of effective treatments that were available for many people. Oftentimes, it just seemed like people were being kept in the hospital and there wasn't really much that we could do for them. And then later in law school, I learned about the law regarding psychedelics and their therapeutic potential. And I found that really frustrating, that we had a lack of effective treatments and we had these very promising substances that had been entirely removed from the hands of scientists for many decades. And it was around that time, 20 2015 or so that I first wrote a paper about the topic, but it was still very stigmatized at that point. This is pre-Michael Pollan, and I think even though there was some research being done, a lot of people were not very comfortable wading into this space.
Yeah. Well, I love hearing that, and the current situation in conventional psychiatry is really hard. There are absolutely amazing psychiatrists out there. The system doesn't really allow them to do the kind of work perhaps they would actually even want to do themselves. The fact that for so many decades there was just no access for even scientists to do basic research on this stuff, it's really held back the field. This is absolutely the most promising class of new drugs in psychiatry. Calling them new is a little absurd too. So
yeah.
For a lot of reasons. So I guess let's dig in. So you recently saw this FDA guidance for psychedelic research in JAMA. What was going on there? I remember that was a pretty robust process. There was a lot of interest in people commenting. But yeah, how did that play out? Or what was your involvement there?
The FDA published this research guidance, so guidance for psychedelic researchers or sponsors of their research, so drug companies basically, in June of this year. And that was really a historic development. It's something that I would have expected at some point, because clearly there's rapidly rising interest in researching psychedelics. The FDA has been supporting that research for some time now. And so at some point, they're going to come out with a document like this. But it surprised a lot of people. And it really is sort of a watershed moment, because it says, okay, they're really taking this quite seriously. And like you said, the agency opened up a comment period. I believe it was 60 days for the public to write in. And the last time I checked, I believe they had around 80 comments or so. And many of them you could see similar themes recurring in these comments, of course. So parts of the guidance were fairly controversial. Other parts were pretty routine and to be expected. We can talk a little bit about those. But what my colleague, Professor Glenn Cohen from Harvard Law School and the Petrie-Flom Center, he and I decided to write an article for the New England Journal of Medicine commenting on that guidance. What was done well, what potentially should warrant further consideration. And I think overall we were pretty supportive of the guidance, but there are some, kind of controversial elements to it.
Yeah. Can you maybe explain a little bit of that controversial stuff there?
Yeah. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the routine stuff, because it is still kind of interesting. I think a lot of it was pretty much to be anticipated. Things like the drug sponsor has to provide the FDA with information about the chemistry of the investigational new drug, or it has to be produced using current good manufacturing practices, as you would hope that it would, things like that. But there were some interesting things that I don't think are particularly controversial. The FDA says, for example, that some of these treatments might actually be botanical drugs. So they could be plant or fungal based. And the reason that's interesting is that the FDA actually has guidance on botanical drugs, but it's very, very unusual for them to be pursued for FDA approval. So one could ask, does that mean that perhaps the FDA is becoming a little more receptive to that in anticipation of FDA-approved psychedelics? We don't really know, but I think it was notable to see that in the guidance. So you could imagine a mushroom-based treatment, a whole mushroom-based treatment, which some people are exploring in other parts of the world. I know
of one public company, I actually advise one of them. They're actually working with whole mushrooms and hoping to bring it all the way through, which is interesting. And I think Numinous even was doing it as well. Now, Numinous for sure with the liquid blend. What's the name of the company? I won't say it out loud, partly because I can't remember, but we're good.
The public wants to know, Joe.
I know, right? Thankfully, we're a private company, but partnered with the university for sure. And it's interesting. We'll see what happens. But I'm very pro whole fungal stuff coming through. Like that hopefully decreases the cost. The synthesis on psilocybin is quite expensive, from what I understand.
Yeah, I'm far from certain that we'll actually see anything like that, but it was an interesting signal in the guidance. And then another notable piece of the recommendations, and by the way, I should say that when an agency like the FDA publishes guidance, it's not technically legally binding. Agencies can create rules through a process called notice and comment rulemaking, where they have a similar process where the public comments on it, but in the end, they have a legally binding rule. Guidance is a little bit less formal, and anything could constitute guidance, even a post by the commissioner of the FDA on a blog or something like that. So, and the FDA tends to rely pretty heavily on guidance. But another piece that was quite interesting was regarding the theoretical heart valve risk of classic psychedelics. I'm sure you've heard about this. So there's a hypothesis that because psychedelics act upon this serotonin 5-HT2B receptor, they could potentially promote overgrowth or hypertrophy of the mitral valve leaflets, the valves the valve in your heart. This has never actually been observed to my knowledge, so it is currently a theoretical risk, but the FDA recommends that if researchers are doing animal research, that they should look at the heart tissue under a microscope for evidence of valvular disease. And
as a physician, do you actually know if like that same receptor site would trigger these kinds of changes? Say, for example, we know it can happen with fen-phen because of the athlete deaths.
Right.
And it's a similar receptor site or the same receptor site. Like, have we seen the same activity in animal models with fen-phen, for instance?
I believe so. I shouldn't say so with certainty, but I'm thinking through the articles that I've read. What I will say is that there have been other substances that pharmacologists have suspected based on that binding that have turned out to cause that valvular issue. That doesn't mean that psychedelics will, or that all of them will. And I would want to actually see the evidence. I think it's prudent to be aware of it and to be cautious. The FDA acknowledges in that guidance that it would be more of an issue if a trial is administering a psychedelic over long periods, so chronically, which we don't usually see in the trials. Usually it's like 2 or 3 administrations that are a couple weeks apart or 3 weeks apart. So we don't typically see long-term administration in trials, but the agency says if you do that, then you should get an echocardiogram, an ultrasound of the heart before and after the trial, and potentially people with pre-existing valve disease or pulmonary hypertension or related condition should be excluded from the trial. So these are like sensible recommendations until we know more. It's not like really, it seems like it's not particularly controversial. But again, to my knowledge, that has never been established definitively.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And yeah, people have been going hard on that topic, and that's really kind of scary to me. Because in the lack of evidence, kind of making this thing a boogeyman is kind of insane to me, given how much psychedelic use has happened in the past and how old, the 60s generation psychedelic enthusiasts are. I proposed a study a while ago that I hope some people pick up. It's EKGs on people over 50 with well over 100 LSD experiences. We should be able to see some stuff there if it's there.
It's a really interesting idea, and I hope people will start doing that kind of research. I think getting it funded is probably the challenge, but that's why it would be great to just integrate it into all trials. That's why I think that's a good recommendation, and then we might actually learn more. But I have seen situations where people have made that claim about a substance, sort of guilt by association, and it's with kratom, because the constituents of kratom bind to the opioid receptor, and even the FDA itself said, because of this, kratom is a dangerous opioid. It turns out that's not true, because as you can imagine, our cells are very complicated machines, and just because something binds to the same receptor doesn't mean it has the same effect on the inside of the cell. Pharmacologists I've spoken with, they are strongly convinced that we will find valvular disease with psychedelics like psilocybin. But I just haven't seen any actual proof of that yet.
Right. Yeah, I had an EKG. This is N of 1, right? But I've had an EKG this year, and they found nothing weird, and I've consumed plenty. So,
Wow.
yeah, N of 1. I'm sure a lot of these Grateful Dead folks are similarly fine. But yeah, there's some activity on Twitter on this topic somewhat recently, and I asked for like, what do you think the rate would be, and they would say around 1%. It was their speculated rate of like occurrence of valvular heart disease. And we'll see. We need the data before we can say anything about it. I still continue to believe these things are quite safe.
Yeah, I'm wary of speculating. I think if you're just introducing pretty simple safety measures, like doing an ultrasound within the context of a clinical trial is not that burdensome. It makes a lot of sense. Why not do it, right? But if you're making more involved policy decisions on that basis, I would question that until there's more information. So,
Yeah.
for example, in Oregon, there were efforts to eliminate any possibility of microdosing under Measure 109 because of this theoretical risk. And I think that would be a mistake for many reasons, because then you're just pushing people to microdose entirely on their own, which I'm not saying necessarily is good or bad. But if you are taking the position that you want to regulate something and observe people while they do it, then you should probably include something like microdosing, which is obviously becoming very popular within that program. And ultimately they did to some extent.
Yeah. My sense is it's like, given psychedelic use is at an all-time high, I think, globally, and many Americans are participating even in microdosing, it's incumbent on the establishment that's supposed to keep us safe to fund research here. I'm a board member at Psychedelic Medicine Coalition. I really hope we can unlock lots of science funding so everybody can do all sorts of research here. It's like really inappropriate how little research is being done with how popular this stuff is right now.
And we seem to be headed in that direction. It's just a matter of how quickly. But I do see more money being unlocked. There was recently an announcement from NIDA with $2 million in funding on psychedelics for substance use, treating substance use conditions. So we're starting to see some federal money being made available. So that's encouraging.
Yeah. Agreed. So I'm curious, Mason, if we can jump to end of life care. Like, this has been a big topic. There's been a lot of our colleagues working on this one, but where do we stand right now with psychedelics for end of life care?
That's a great question. When I first learned about psychedelics, I found their use toward the end of life to be one of the most interesting, promising, and important applications. I mean, how could you not want to rigorously study something that could potentially ease the anxiety and depression of people who are facing their own mortality? It just seems like incredibly important. And I was really inspired by Roland Griffith's work out of Johns Hopkins with people with advanced life-threatening illness and utilizing psilocybin to address their anxiety and depression. Unfortunately, though, I think that application of psychedelics has largely been overlooked or overshadowed, at least by other applications. The big applications that you think of, like depression and PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
But in looking sort of at the landscape and what people are talking about and thinking about, I had hoped that we might sort of reinvigorate interest in this area. And then other people are writing about this too. But there hasn't been a lot of discussion. So there is a lack of research in the area, but there's also a lack of discussion about how would you actually integrate psychedelics into end-of-life care. You're dealing with a patient population that has very complex medical conditions. They have very complex medication regimens. These are the people that are usually screened out of psychedelic clinical trials. So you don't know a lot about how they will respond to psychedelics. And obviously Aldous Huxley famously asked for a dose of LSD on his deathbed and appeared to have had a positive experience. Difficult to know for sure, but it's easy to imagine giving a psychedelic to someone in a similar circumstance. They could have a very unpleasant experience, and it would be tragic to make their final moments or final weeks or months really unpleasant. So again, I wrote a paper with some of my colleagues, Professor Glenn Cohen and Carmel Shahar from Harvard Law School, as well as Brent Kies from the University of Utah, on integrating psychedelics into end-of-life care. So we just kind of mapped out what some of the challenges might be, how to approach some of them, things like how do you handle informed consent in patients who might have somewhat diminished cognitive ability or whose cognitive abilities are declining? Is it feasible to use things like advanced directives, a legal instrument where you express your wishes while you still can clearly, or healthcare proxies where someone else makes healthcare decisions on your behalf? Is that an appropriate way? Could someone write into those instruments that they want to use psychedelics once they have difficulty communicating? So a lot of very difficult ethical questions here, but ultimately, I think the most important thing to be done is to start involving people with complex health conditions and medication regimens into psychedelic research.
So, is it clear? Like, I'm sure this isn't going to happen in Oregon because Oregon has specifically supported adult use. But is there anything going on in Colorado that might be able to support end-of-life care?
I read something recently, and I'm trying to recall where it was, about discussions being had in that vein. Mm-hmm. So I think there are people talking about it. There are discussions of home administration, I think, which is partially geared towards that population potentially. Mm-hmm. But I've been watching the Natural Medicine Advisory Board closely. I'd say that many of the people on the board are very skeptical of home administration. I do worry a little bit about how available that will be to people. And they've also discussed whether it would actually be possible to even have psychedelics in a hospice facility or palliative care center. And many people believe that's not feasible because those types of healthcare facilities won't let medical marijuana anywhere near the building because they can potentially lose their Medicare and Medicaid funding. And I would think it would be at least as much of a problem, if not more, with psychedelics. So those are some problems that need to be solved before we can really answer that. Of course, people could use psychedelics under the personal use side of the Natural Medicine Health Act, but that's kind of a different animal.
Right. I'm hoping eventually there will be some sort of tapestry bridging the clinical with the more decriminalized personal use framework, and because there are going to be so many limitations on this kind of legal framework that it will necessitate people operating in the kind of not explicitly legal world, which is unfortunate, but it's kind of I don't know, the way I have to think about it as an individual that lives here in Colorado is it's unfortunately born of political practicality and moving things forward. And I hope things can evolve. If cannabis is any example, it won't. But, I hope we can, be a little bit more progressive here in time.
Have you seen the recent reports about this was just in the past week or so, there was a report of a sort of a dispensary that was set up in Denver by an individual on the personal use side, as well as a group of women who went to a therapist for psychedelic therapy. And so, I mean, that raises a whole bunch of questions and possible concerns.
That's wild. Good for them, but holy shit, that's a big risk, legally speaking. Yeah, and not to mention just, licensure as well, right? Like that's a clear violation of license stuff. And the dispensary, no, I haven't heard of that either. Obviously, if there's financial transactions happening, that's a big deal. There was a guy in my county who was set up in front of a grocery store recently selling stickers, and you would get gifted mushrooms. That got ended quite quickly by the police. That used to work a little bit in cannabis, but certainly not yet in the psychedelic space. It's edgy, and people are taking those risks.
This is gifting, and so he is offering education and information to people, accompanied by a gift of the psychedelic. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any response whatsoever. This was published in a fairly visible platform. I think it might have been.
I know these people, and it's like, to me, it's like it's gambling with your freedom, and I wouldn't be encouraging a single person to be taking risks like that, because it's definitely, in my opinion, not clear. It's not supported by prior case law even that they will have a defensible position. Like I don't ever want to be first in line with gambling with my freedom. That's me. But if people want to do that, that's cool, I guess. Somebody has to go first. So thank you.
I think it's very unclear. Unclear. I think the original version of the Natural Medicine Health Act was a little clearer. The scope of activities that it allowed people to do on the personal use side was a little broader. And with the amendment, the subsequent amendment, Senate Bill 290, the language on the personal use side regarding what people could do was changed. I interpret it as being quite a bit more narrow. It uses language like harm reduction as opposed to the original initiative, which used language like guide and things like that. So, I would think a guide would be something more like what you think of as a facilitator, whereas a harm reduction service might be something else. Potentially it could be a facilitator, but that, like you said, it really is gray.
Yeah, it's tricky. And what else did you notice in that amendment? Can you point to any kind of like key highlights?
Yeah, there's a lot. One important thing has to do with what a healing center can do. So under the original ballot initiative, a healing center was incredibly broadly defined. It could be a manufacturer. It could be a healing. It could be what you think of as a service center, sort of what healing centers have become under the amendment. And on my interpretation, and John Dennis, we read this together early on, and we interpret it to allow even dispensary type healing centers. And so it was really very kind of a blank canvas. A healing center could be so many different things. And that may largely be one of the things that led some legislators to kind of crack down and make it more conventional, or more similar to Oregon, at least in that way. They divided up what was just a single license for all businesses, healing center license, divided it up into the different manufacturing, testing, service center, and facilitator. So that considerably constricted what was possible. Another sort of bizarre change was that, well, of course, there was an indigenous task force that was supposed to be created. So that was included. I haven't heard anything.
Not been created.
I haven't heard anything about it. I did read in a piece of Colorado News, I don't remember the outlet, that reported it as though it had been created, but I haven't seen anything to suggest that. Also, the board and the agencies, the governing agencies, are having a really, really difficult time knowing what to do about traditional or indigenous healers. And the amendment SB-290, it added a paragraph about them to the regulated side, which I find a little concerning because it creates what the board often refers to as a carve-out, where indigenous traditional healers, religious practitioners, they can act as facilitators in a sense, but they have to say that they have to disclose that they're not licensed under the Natural Medicine Health Act, and they can't work on a for-profit basis. So it raises the question: can they be compensated for their time and labor? And to me, it suggests that they might not be allowed to. They cannot advertise, and so from my perspective, it's a bit odd because for a bill that at the very top of the amendment, it says it really prioritizes indigenous and traditional healers' rights, but yet you have this regulated side of the law that allows licensed, DORA licensed facilitators to be paid to advertise. But if you're a traditional healer, you cannot be paid, you cannot advertise. It actually seems discriminatory against the traditional or indigenous healers.
That's really interesting. And to be clear, it's not restricting indigenous healers from taking the training and becoming licensed, perhaps, but
correct. But that is a huge debate right now that the board keeps circling back to over and over and over again. Some people on the board, a minority of members, believe that there should be special rules created to accommodate traditional healers. They shouldn't be expected to, if they want to be licensed, that should be their right. But if they're expected to go through a westernized medical training program, that to many people seems wrong. And so we get people talking past each other. We get people on one hand saying, well, we don't need to worry about those groups because they have the exemption that I've just discussed. They just can't, advertise. They can't be compensated. They have to disclose they're not.
They'll be fine with no money. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's crazy.
And it is, my understanding, I don't speak for these groups, but obviously my understanding is that it is customary for people to be compensated, maybe not with money, but sometimes with, there may be some kind of barter or, in many cases, and that could potentially prohibit that. But you have people saying, don't worry about those groups because they have the exemption. You have other people saying, well, what if they want to become licensed? We shouldn't just, force them to go through the same training. So really there's two options there. There's create special training and licensure for them, or there is this idea of allowing them to sort of provide some kind of verification of their experience, and then maybe they can either get advanced credit, like people can in theory in Oregon, although I believe it's up to the particular training programs. And no one knows how to do that. No one knows how to say, how do we assess whether someone has the relevant experience to sort of bypass some of the training requirements. So in my view, that's why I think the original version of the initiative was better, at least in that respect, because there was no question that people could be compensated, including indigenous and traditional healers. They just could not be compensated for the substance. They could be compensated for their time and their services. That eliminates a big part of this problem. But I can see the perspective that there should be a separate sort of path. This is what John Dennis pushed for in Oregon, is have rules that acknowledge and respect traditional healers, but that hit a dead end. And I don't know that we'll have a different outcome in Colorado.
Right. It's interesting, right? Then we have to like, there's so many legal definitions and things that need to get done here to make progress on this. And it's not easy with how political and kind of siloed this situation is. Like it's not actually easy to participate in this process, even as a resident of Colorado. It's complex, and I've been at this for a bit now in Colorado, and the fact that I wasn't really included in much of any of it. I found out about this after the bill was written. I'm like, oh, fascinating. Okay, cool. Great guys. But I want to be a team player. I want to move this thing forward. I do believe in some sort of legal framework. I just don't know what that means. I also believe in a very robust, not so legal framework. But that's me.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I think there is, in terms of participation by the public and other stakeholders, Colorado really stands in stark contrast to Oregon. And I was very surprised by this. Oregon, had the Oregon rulemaking process, over the past 3 years now, has had many things that I would criticize, but many things have been done very well. And one of those things is the transparency in some ways, but maybe not others, of the Oregon Health Authority. They make all of their meetings, the recordings are available. You can go to a repository, listen to any of their meetings online. They publish all the documents that are discussed. And when you join the meeting, you can see everyone in the meeting, including the public. But in Colorado, everything is locked down very tight. They don't record the meetings. They're not available to the public. You can't see other members of the public, so you have no idea how many people are even in a meeting. There's no listening. Usually at the end of an Oregon meeting, they have an opportunity for public comment. That doesn't happen in Colorado. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I do know that the public has had a significant influence in Oregon. And in many ways, like you were alluding to, cannot have that influence as easily in Colorado.
Right. Has the state really described why they're keeping it so locked down and like closed to comment?
No. They do have listening sessions periodically. So there are opportunities, but they're very infrequent where one can log on and speak to them. And strangely, they do make those meetings available to the public, but not the board. Another odd thing I've noticed about the Colorado board is lately they have a lot of meetings have been canceled at the last minute for lack of quorum. And last week,
for lack of quorum.
Quorum, yeah.
Wow.
And they have a monthly full board meeting where I believe sometimes they have 3 or 4 hours allotted, and they often cut the meeting short after an hour and a half. Last week, I think it was an hour and 20 minutes. And it's surprising with so much work to be done and so little time in which to do it. There seems to be a lack of urgency or something like that when it comes to these board meetings.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I wish it was more straightforward and less confusing, and I'm somewhat paranoid by nature, so of course I read into everything too.
Well, what do you think?
I think there's some sort of anti-democratic process going because of the chutzpah that was happening in Colorado right around the time the bill was coming in, all this energy and negative attention in Oregon. And they said, we can't afford this kind of negative attention and democratic process. It's cheaper to not be democratic here, and perhaps works in the interest of the funds coming from PSFC to New Approach and in a more convenient fashion for them. And it's clear they're kind of holding a lot more power than the citizens are in this whole process, based on my observations. But, New Approach, please reach out. I've wanted to chat with you guys for a while. PSFC, I want to understand you. Please tell me everything so I can share with the world. But, I want to eliminate the shadows and shine lights on these things so we can stop being so paranoid. Unless I need to be paranoid. You tell me, guys. Feel free to reach out and we can have a conversation. And I'm always here for you.
Very generous of you. I'm
really
sure
want an open door policy with them.
They'll be calling any day now.
Let's see. All right, cool. So let's jump over to Fordham. So it looks like there's a law school conference happening over there. What's going on there?
Yes. So we, the project on Psychedelics Law and Regulation, POPLAR, at the Petrie-Flom Center, we have a very exciting conference coming up on February 16th in collaboration with the Fordham Law Review. So this is Fordham Law School on near Lincoln Center on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And this is a conference called Drug Law for the 21st Century. And we thought of this conference idea to sort of celebrate the 50-year birthday of the DEA. So we're kind of looking back on 50 years of law enforcement-led drug policy and envisioning what a different path might look like, something informed by scientific evidence and public health. So we have an all-star lineup of people coming to that on February 16th. We haven't sent out the formal announcement yet, but I'm excited to do that soon. And it will be broadcast virtually as well for people who want to attend remotely.
It's amazing. I love that it's happening in the city. That's a big deal, I think. Have there been legal conferences before on this topic?
I'm sure there have in the more distant past. I'm not aware of anything. There was also a conference I should give a little plug for at the University of Miami, and it's a similar type of thing. It's a law review symposium. I'm blanking on the date, but I think it's in March or April. And I'm not involved in organizing that conference, but I'm excited to see another conference on drug policy. And I think they have there's some overlapping themes there. So I think that will also be a great event. But regarding psychedelics, we are having the Petrie-Flom Center has an annual conference. And this year we are focusing on the law and policy of psychedelic medicine. So that will be in late June. Mm-hmm. And to my knowledge, that will be the first law school conference on psychedelic law. And there will be an edited volume, a book that comes out of the contributions that speakers make to the conference.
I love that. So for a lay audience, what does a legal conference want to discuss around all this fun stuff?
That's a good question, because some legal conferences do consist of legal academics talking to each other about very abstract theoretical concepts or very, very niche legal points. And that's not the intent of this conference. We do intend for there to be serious legal scholarship there, but it is an interdisciplinary conference where we will have medical professionals, we'll have health policy experts. And so it will be very diverse in terms of the perspectives and the backgrounds and the methodologies that people bring to this conference. So I think that it would be something that would be very accessible, as opposed to some legal conferences, which can be, fairly inaccessible to the average person.
Right. When I hear you and John Dennis kind of speak and discuss kind of like precedent, all this kind of fun stuff, I'm like, okay, I've spent enough time with attorneys where I can keep up, but most people haven't. And just understanding that flow, like, because it's an interesting kind of philosophy in a way. I don't necessarily have the same kind of respect that you guys would for judges and their rulings. I've heard John say, like, I really respect your ruling there. I'm like, what the?
That was a beautiful opinion, very elegant.
Yeah, I'm like, oh my God. Like, why say something nice to somebody in power? I don't know. Like, I choose not to say nice things to people in power because that's kind of my orientation. But, you know, I see attorneys kind of do that, but that's kind of the dynamic, right? Because you're playing with judges, like they're kind of peers, but also kind of like the squeeze point through which you have to like make your stuff go through, kind of, right? Very different dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I love the law because it's sort of like the rules by which society functions, and I think that's why law and psychedelics is so interesting, and that's why we founded this project POPLAR in the first place. Was that we saw that there were academic medical programs popping up all over the world, so they're focusing on clinical trials. But it's really the law that is the bottleneck in a lot of the scientific progress. So there wasn't anyone focusing on fully investigating that bottleneck. How do we actually change the law, open up the valve so that we can get more scientific research done? And so that was sort of the impetus for this project. And that will certainly be one of the themes that we discuss at the conference in June. And then I mentioned to you that this semester I'm teaching a course on psychedelic law at Florida State University, which I believe is the first course of its kind on that topic. And it's just really exciting to engage with law students who I think back to my legal education. I could never imagine a course like that on psychedelics, although there was a marijuana law course at Vanderbilt Law School. Professor Robert Mikos is a pioneer in that area and literally wrote the book, the big, thick, red legal text that you imagine law students lugging around. So Vanderbilt was very pioneering in offering a course on Schedule I controlled drugs on cannabis in this case, but it's incredible to think how far we've come in just 5-8 years to have psychedelic law course at Florida State. And then next semester in the spring, we'll have the same course, myself and Professor Cohen at Harvard Law School. And it's just a lot of fun to interact with students on all of these things that you and I are talking about.
So we're quite protean, I guess, relative to the understanding we have of cannabis law in the country. Like obviously there's nothing federally legal. There's a few things at the state level that are legal, but they're still federally illegal. Like how should we be thinking about this as people in the space, like this dynamic between like state, municipal, and federal, and perhaps even international, right? Because like Oregon is now breaking kind of by the United States, like federal government not clamping down on Oregon. The United States is now in violation of international treaties that we've kind of forced on the world around controlled substances. Like, how do we want to think about this as kind of weird legal situation?
That is a good question. There are some similarities to cannabis, the Schedule I controlled substance status, of course, and violating federal law. But there are really substantial differences between cannabis and laws like the supported adult use laws like Oregon's. And I don't think enough attention has been paid to that, to those differences and how the federal government might respond. I hear it come up periodically during board discussions. It comes up more frequently in Colorado than it did in Oregon, but it's usually pretty quickly dismissed. I think, I have concerns about the way that these programs are shaping up, and I'm actually a bit more concerned about Colorado and the way that the agencies and the board are going about crafting this program, because in many ways they are creating a duplicate of the healthcare system in ways that I think will be problematic once we start to get FDA approved drugs. So I don't think enough attention has been paid to that. There are a lot of people who, And there are more and more academics writing about psychedelic policy, but it's still kind of a fringe area. I think we're hoping that our conferences can help jumpstart that a little bit, provide a little more data for policymakers to draw from. But I think these are very, very different. I mean, just think about the way that a cannabis dispensary works. A person goes to the store, they buy the cannabis, they take it home, they use it whenever they want, however they want, for whatever purpose they want. And even medical cannabis is not that different. The healthcare professional is not really very involved. They're not dispensing the cannabis in the medical office or in the clinic. So it's a very, 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 very different.
Have we seen those cannabis doctors providing prescriptions at risk of losing licensure at any point with their boards or whatever else?
They were at risk of losing their DEA registration. So, but this was back in, I mean, there's a very famous case that came out of this, Conant v. Walters, where it was argued that it was a First Amendment right of doctors to talk about marijuana, medical marijuana, in this way with patients. But as I'm sure you know, they don't actually write prescriptions. They write what's called a recommendation. So it's seen as a free speech, a First Amendment issue, that doctors have this right to talk about marijuana. But they're not. It's very different than someone actually administering ibogaine to a patient in the clinic. And so it's a completely different set of problems.
Right. I heard rumor of a doctor trying to access some of these services in the psychedelic space recently. And the question was, okay, who is going to clinically administer this to me? And I was like, whoa, like that, like we can't use that language yet on account of the legal status of these substances. And it's just fascinating, like how even a prescriber active in America right now is thinking about this stuff. Somehow assuming a unprescribable substance is, legal. It's fascinating. So we have a long way to go.
Yeah. Even in Oregon, technically by law, if you look at the law and you look at the Oregon Health Authority's rules to implement Measure 109, there's no question it's a non-medical program. It's effectively, people hate it when I use this word, and but it's a supervised recreational program, where technically speaking, and I'm not sure I like the word recreational. You could call it adult use.
Yeah, adult use is what I lean on, because there's all sorts of ways you could be not exactly recreating.
Yeah, but
crying in the bathroom for 6 hours isn't recreating to me.
I think recreational is problematic for many reasons. Because, well, first of all,
I hear what you're saying, though.
Yeah, I don't know that we should even be judging people for recreating, whatever that means. But it is a confusing term. But whatever term you use to describe adult use cannabis, that's really what Oregon is, with the change that there is the supervision component, and it creates a lot of problems, to be honest. One of them is the incredible cost that we're seeing for people, where they pay at minimum $1,500 to $3,000 for a single round of psilocybin services in Oregon. And of course, a lot of the expense, it comes from having this dedicated service center that you have to maintain. And so there are some people talking about doing away with that, taking a different approach, where you might invest more in the facilitators and who could work in many different environments. And this has been discussed a little bit in Colorado in the context of home administration. And in theory, the law would allow administration to occur in other locations other than the home. But I don't think the board and the agencies are very receptive to other venues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. It's this whole thing is quite the quagmire, and I think we'll work our way through it eventually. But to me, it has to be a multi-tiered situation, and certain people have to take certain risks, and others, take different risks, and sharing that burden to me is going to have to be a big part of that. Yeah, I could see for sure people losing their license, their DEA license, here, as prescribers in Colorado. Like I'm actually kind of shocked. Well, not shocked, somewhat impressed, I guess, by the feds that we haven't seen raids in Oregon on state level legal facilities. We saw plenty of raids in cannabis and early cannabis, in Colorado and California. And, it's really fascinating to me. We'll see, right? Like the DEA kind of did their little flap of terror with the Cole Milner case in Denver and a few others. And we'll see if that persists or comes back at all.
I think the DEA has more important things to do in many cases, like fentanyl trafficking, for example, and ensuring
that's to me a lost cause. But yeah, for sure. Like, let's work on things that actually could save lives and stop violence.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that service centers in Oregon are their highest priority. But I think we could see other types of federal intervention, other problems that maybe are not. I think there's a lot of time spent worrying about the DEA, as there should be, but not at the expense of other concerns. So to give you one example, there was a meeting of the Colorado board where they were talking about how they used the word chocolate in one of the proposals, making a chocolate bar of psilocybin. And someone objected and said, well, we should take the word chocolate out because, that might cause the DEA to come busting down the door because you're encouraging children to take psilocybin. And I think that's taking it a little bit too far. That's not going to be the thing that's going to cause a backlash. I mean, they settled on something like edibles instead of the word chocolate. But when you're talking about a system that's not open to people under the age of 21, you just, a lot of these decisions are made for the sake of appearances, with the belief that it's somehow going to assuage concerns of the DEA. But there are many other problems that you've talked about, like what kind of liabilities are healthcare professionals creating for themselves? Outside of the DEA, just, can they actually participate in this program? And a lot of these things are very unclear. And I think a lot of these issues are waved away by people in authority. They'll just say, well, it's all illegal. So, there's a risk involved if you want to enter this space, but it's a lot more complicated than that.
Right. And, your comment there makes me suggest that people should be reading the history of the drug war, understand the history of the drug war and why these things are illegal. Read, 3 to 10 books on the topic, and you'll, be in the 95th percentile, right?
Absolutely.
Or higher. Yeah, maybe higher. So it's important. Like, we really need to understand this and understand where things have gone wrong and why we're dealing with the things we're dealing with in the way we are. Mason, I'm curious if you could, we only have like 5-10 minutes left. Could you talk a little bit about the $16 million grant to Harvard that came through recently?
Yeah, there was an incredible gift to Harvard University from the Gracias Foundation, $16 million to fund interdisciplinary research at several different schools and departments. So primarily the Divinity School, the Law School, and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And one very interesting thing about this gift is that not only that it's interdisciplinary, but also that it's looking at how psychedelics will impact society and culture. So it's not overtly looking at medical applications, although that could certainly be a part of it. But it's broad, and it's involving a lot of different types of academics and students. And it's really exciting to see that kind of investment in education at such an elite institution.
Mm. Is there anything in particular you would hope for from this kind of project?
I think that there has been some interdisciplinary work, some collaboration between departments at Harvard, and I think the hope for everyone is that this will really facilitate that. I think we need that. We need people from the divinity school talking to people at the law school and other departments. One component of this is a partnership with the Berkeley Center for Psychedelics, and so there is some even cross-institutional, cross-university, inter-university collaboration is one piece of this. But I think that's the biggest part. A lot of times, people in the psychedelic space do exist in silos a bit, and so that would be one big hope. And it's also very exciting that this will help fund the work that we started through POPLAR back in 2021. And so it's just really exciting to see that that work that we've done over the past few years kind of contribute to this development.
Yeah, I love that. And is there a general sentiment right now at Harvard around psychedelics? Like what are you hearing from your colleagues there?
There's a lot of excitement. I hear from people from all throughout the university, students and faculty who are interested in getting involved. We have, over the past few years, had a lot of virtual events. Obviously, on the tails of the pandemic, it became very customary to have a lot of remote meetings. I think we'll have a lot more in-person meetings. I think people are really excited about that, like the conference in June. But there is a lot of excitement, and we work with law students and students from other schools at POPLAR at the Petrie-Flom Center.
Mm-hmm.
But I think just there is a great demand, I think, for the course that we're offering in the spring at the law school. So there's a lot of demand for this kind of content, and that funding, as well as funding that originally made POPLAR possible, which is from the SciSafe Foundation. Very grateful for that, and just excited to see where things go. I mean, it's really been a real privilege to be a part of it.
Now, we were a little critical and down here and there, but I'm kind of curious on the optimistic side. Like, what is it that's making you excited about this whole psychedelic project we're working on together?
I'm very bullish on psychedelics. Despite a lot of the negative press that we see lately, sort of the slump in excitement or kind of anti-hype that we're seeing now. But I remain very bullish on them, not only for what they can potentially do for medicine and the practice of medicine, and it remains to be seen which areas exactly, but just for basic science, research involving the brain and consciousness and things that we really know very little about as a society. So that is incredibly exciting. There's great promise. I think there will be a lot more research, but I'm less optimistic about the state programs. I think it could be a rough road ahead. I've said previously that I wasn't sure the Oregon program was sustainable because it's already run out of money once and had to ask the legislature for a bailout with taxpayer funds of over $3 million. I anticipate that happening again and again because Not to go down a rabbit hole on this, but that program is set up in such a way that it has to be paid for. Its administration has to be paid for by the license fees for businesses. But because it's so difficult and risky for a business to operate, we don't see that many of them. And so the health authority has captured a small fraction of what it actually needs to run the program. I think in the past year, it collected about $300,000 in license fees, whereas it required over $3 million to keep the lights on for 2 years. So I don't know.
Do you think it was by design they didn't earmark enough cash, or was it just a mistake, or what do you think happened there?
I think there were political reasons, most likely from making the system self-sustaining. You can make a promise to the voters, vote for this, it's not going to cost you any tax dollars. So I think from a strategic perspective, it's advantageous to make it self-funded. They originally asked for twice that, over $6 million. That was chopped down to the 3.2 million figure. So they did ask for more money. Now, one thing we didn't really talk about, which I would love to discuss briefly if you have the time.
Yeah, please.
Is the data collection bill, SB-303.
Oh, yes. That's what I really wanted to talk about. Sorry.
And just speaking about expense, though, when the sponsor of that bill, Senator Elizabeth Steiner, was attempting to push it through the legislature, through committees, she made the promise that it had no cost associated with it, and even somehow produced a report that said that to that effect. But some legislators were very skeptical of that. I was very skeptical of that. And then it turned out ultimately, according to the health authority, they estimated it would cost, if I recall correctly, at a minimum about $280,000 per year. So obviously over the course of 5 years, that really adds up. So that's only going to exacerbate the budget problems that already exist in Oregon.
And now, what do you think this whole privacy thing? OHSU is involved, the public university there. So, thankfully we can get public records requests to find out what's happening internally.
No, you cannot, because a lot of the information is exempted from. Well, actually, I know that with certainty for Colorado. That was put into the bill, where any data collected is exempt from public records.
Oh, I meant around email transfers, so you could figure out what's happening, not necessarily around specific elements of the data that would be collected.
Possibly, although John and I, have learned what happens is that, there's a whole art to public records requests, and if they don't want you to get the records, the holder of those records, they can make it extremely difficult for you to obtain them. So it remains to be seen whether that would be viable. Just to give people a little background on this, Measure 109, the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act that voters approved in November 2020, that created the industry, the psilocybin industry in Oregon. And it had very, very strong confidentiality protections for clients. No data from a client was to leave a service center except in 5 cases that would all be pretty unusual. So something like there's evidence of that the client might harm themselves or someone else, that a child had been harmed, or the agency opens an investigation into a service center. So really, it would be very unusual. Under most circumstances, a client's data would never leave the center. That's really important because we're talking about not only evidence of a federal crime, but also potentially extremely sensitive information. Psychedelic, it's in the word, right? That their mind manifesting. So we're talking about really sensitive, deeply held information that might be bubbling up that people might not ordinarily share. And so that was a really great feature of Measure 109. But we talked about the rulemaking process in Oregon, which was 2 years, and the health authority published rules in December. And less than 2 weeks later, Senator Steiner unveiled this SB-303 data collection bill that really turned the confidentiality provisions on their head, kind of gutted them, and actually required really sensitive personal information to be shared with the Oregon Health Authority. And just to make a long story short, there was great pushback from the public and grassroots activists, and there was a compromise and an amendment introduced so that the data collected was only aggregate data, not personally identifiable data, and clients could opt out entirely of the of this data collection program.
Yeah, the idea of not being able to opt out is quite spooky. I don't really understand the logic there. My speculation is that New Approach, PSFC, they probably promised their donors scientific data as a result of their donations, and this is them trying to meet their obligation to their donors. That's my speculative kind of footprint. I have no idea if there's other corporate interests involved. Like I haven't been able to get enough info on PSFC New Approach. So in time, hopefully you guys call me and we can have some fun conversations and try to dig in on like what is going on there. You know, one way to cut off my paranoia, folks, and PSFC and New Approach, talk to me. Let's have a conversation. Would love it. And,
that would be great. I would love to see that.
Yeah.
But this issue is very timely because it was just this week that the health authority was taking public comments on a new set of rules to implement this data collection bill. And one of the most shocking parts of this was that the Healing Advocacy Fund, which worked very closely with Senator Steiner during the legislative process, they completely reversed their position. So throughout the legislative process, so in the committees of the Senate and the House of the Oregon legislature, the Healing Advocacy Fund and Senator Steiner repeatedly emphasized the importance of this opt-out provision, and it was an unqualified right. They referred to it as going to be overt and explicit and very clear, but during discussions of the rules that the health authority put forward, they changed their position and said, oh, no, all along, we've said that clients could opt out of some information, but not others. And it's just the most bizarre interpretation of both the text of the law itself and the history of it. And I made a video I'll share with you of all the times that they said, the most important thing about this is the clients can opt out, or they underlined it and put it in yellow highlighter or bold text. And they said that opt-out was created as a response to these privacy concerns. So it's irrefutable that the intent all along was to allow clients to opt out entirely from having any of this, what they call 303 data, shared with the health authority. And so comments closed last night, and it's now in the health authority's hands to see. But to their credit, the health authority appears to believe otherwise, and under the current rules, one can opt out entirely. So many people were urging them to just, see that through, stick to their guns, and continue to protect that right.
So you do have evidence that the things they're saying aren't exactly truthful when they're changing their tune here. Yeah,
completely. There was what they call rules advisory committees, or RACs, where the health authority assembles a group of stakeholders and has them discuss the draft rules. Healing Advocacy Fund had a seat on one of those RACs. And one of their staff, Heidi Pendergast, said she sort of unveiled this new interpretation that no one had ever heard of before, that clients couldn't, there was some data they couldn't opt out of transferring to OHA. And I would say that it shocked a lot of the other members of the RAC. They just thought that does not make any sense, including a lawyer and data protection expert. And then after the RACs last week, they had public listening sessions where members of the public come and speak. And that's where the Healing Advocacy Fund said this was the intent of SB-303 all along, which just frankly, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. In fact, there's a mountain of evidence to the contrary.
Fascinating. So again, this is an invite to those involved to come forward and let's have your story shared. Yeah. And in the absence of your story, things might get a little strange for the public psyche. So
there should be more open debates like this. I saw a debate recently that Jules Evans was advertising a debate about whether psychotherapy or psychological support is necessary as a part of psychedelic medicine. And there are two people that are going to debate that. I think that's really interesting. I would love to see people debate that and other issues like the data collection issues, but you just don't see a lot of open debate in this space. Have you seen much of that?
No, because we get factionalized quite quickly here, and people are a little too sharp with their tongue, and as a result, people aren't willing to talk to each other, as opposed to saying, "Oh, you're also a fellow citizen. Let's have a conversation and try to figure things out," as opposed to "I'm right, you're wrong. My power is bigger than yours," or whatever it is. There's just so many things working against open, good conversation. For me, I've seen so much bad behavior from folks out there that I'm just like, I can't even in good conscience like have conversations with a lot of folks in the space right now, because I just haven't seen integrity, and as a result, I just can't engage, if that makes sense.
It does.
Unless I'm gonna like try to publicly shame them for their breach of integrity, which I don't think that's my gig. It's not really what I want to do with my time.
It's strange to me coming from legal academia, where it's very common for people to debate, an opinion or an argument, and just not take it personally, and it's not necessarily always as kind and courteous as one might hope, but it's far more common in that setting. But hopefully,
right. Yeah. There's always debate in academia. It's also vicious in academia.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I don't understand. Like, I've chosen to not go the academic route for a lot of reasons, including just how mean-spirited it seems in there. Yes, there's healthy debate, but what the fuck are people doing with their, energy? Like, why get so spiteful and hateful and like, not just work towards a constructive end for, the betterment of humanity here, folks? It's kind of what we're doing.
I think in law, it's pretty accepted that people will attack your position, and that can be part of
the attack of position. It's just the mean-spirited aspect of the attacks are what drives me nuts.
Yeah.
Because we have to, if you're going to attack somebody's position, like if you're not attacking the position, you're not debating, really, in a way.
I will tell you, it will be very interesting to see what kind of data plan they come up with in Colorado. And I think they have a listening session coming up at the end of November, maybe in December, on data collection. And so the public can go to that and weigh in on that. What kind of data collection should there be? They don't have the restrictions that existed in Oregon. In Oregon, you kind of had this very strong protection. So the starting point was strong protection. If you wanted to shift away to heavy data collection, you had to bring it all the way over here. Colorado kind of starts, from a spot where any type of data collection is, with some limitations, is possible. So we're going to see we might see some debate there. And in Massachusetts too, if this ballot initiative is successful next year.
We'll see. It would be fascinating. Have you heard any, before we wrap, have you heard any movement about what might be happening in New Jersey specifically lately? I know there was some interesting action recently, but kind of went quiet for me.
I have not been following it as closely, to be honest. I've been paying a lot of attention to California, Massachusetts. I know there's some interest in a bill in Vermont, Illinois, but I haven't followed New Jersey quite as closely lately.
Yeah, and I know some people working on one in New Mexico, but haven't heard too much from there. Well, anyway, Mason, anything else you want to share with the listeners here today?
Well, we didn't really talk about the controversial parts of the FDA guidance, and I think maybe that's a good place to end. We talked a little bit about, or I guess I brought it up, the debate that I mentioned about the role of psychotherapy or psychological support in psychedelic medicine. That was actually addressed in the FDA guidance, and we addressed it in the New England Journal article. It was controversial because the FDA said that the role of psychological support is not well characterized. We don't really know what role it plays. And in a lot of the comments, I saw people reacting very strongly to that, saying that the FDA didn't understand the importance of psychological support and didn't really understand psychedelics very well. I think our position was that this is actually quite sensible position of the FDA to take. And I don't think they're saying that psychological support is not important. They're saying that we just don't really know the role that it plays. There haven't really been studies comparing no support versus support or different types of support. So what happens if you give psilocybin to 100 people and provide them with one type of therapy and give 100 to, give a different 100, a different type of therapy with psilocybin. And so I think the FDA was just really drawing attention to that and requiring, they were suggesting that sponsors or researchers justify the inclusion of psychological support, which, as you can imagine, was troubling to a lot of people in various circles. But the FDA is not very comfortable with regulating that kind of thing. It's not really that, they regulate drugs. And so I think if they don't need to do it, they will avoid it. And I think it makes sense to really figure out through research what is beneficial. There could be forms of psychological support that are essential to the benefit. There could be some that are not necessary, don't really do much, or they could even be harmful. And we have to be open to that and not just make assumptions. So that was a very controversial part of the guidance that we thought, warranted further discussion. And then the only other one I'll mention is the credentials of people who can be facilitators in clinical trials, which they call monitors. A primary monitor, a lead monitor, and an assistant monitor. And the lead monitor has to have mental health credentials like an MD or a PsyD or a social work degree, and they have to be able they have to be trained in psychotherapy and be able to practice independently. And then the assistant monitor has to have a bachelor's degree and a year of experience working in a licensed mental health care facility. So it's very psychiatry, mental health focused. And we argued in the paper that it might be helpful to broaden that a bit, because there might be people like chaplains who work in hospitals, or there are nurse anesthetists who can practice independently in some states. They are very comfortable working with people in altered states of consciousness. They could make great monitors. And the reason this is important, we're only talking about research here, but the research will influence the norms of the practice of psychedelic medicine when it is, FDA approved and available.
Mm, yeah. I I'll do one of my normal plugs here, Mason. Like it's it's not necessarily that credentials are going to guarantee a certain level of performance. Like in many cases, people with credentials could actually be the ones doing harm, and we've seen that in not only conventional psychiatry and therapy, but in psychedelics as well. So just something we have to think about, and hopefully people can understand and handle that kind of nuance. People like simple answers. Complexity is scary and challenging for folks. So I just hope people can kind of understand that.
Well, I really want to know what you think of this.
Mm-hmm.
And I apologize for making you run long. But I think I really want to know. One of the recommendations was that researchers report the subjective effects of psychedelics. So a perceptual change, or what you might describe as a mystical experience, as an abuse-related adverse event. And that was another controversial.
Hold on, a mystical experience. If somebody has a mystical experience in clinic, that's an abuse-related event?
Correct.
The biggest thing I see there is, how do you do informed consent around a mystical experience, the thing that's by definition ineffable? How are you going to do informed consent? I don't think we understand that as a species yet. We barely understand mysticism. And like to say, okay, cool, like American public, now you have to deal with and regulate mysticism. Like that's insane and somewhat stupid. Calling it abuse, I think, is outrageous. I think, you might be talking about a case that I've been avoiding reading anything about, but I'm just I have a lot of triggers. We'll put it that way. So I avoid a lot of content. That said, religious people should understand that mystical things can happen. People jumping into psychedelics should understand that mystical states can happen. It's not. Who is it incumbent on to disclose this kind of stuff? The person providing the substance, probably, but really it's something that we all need to cultivate and develop. Like we need to say, hey, here's like the large lexicon of things that could happen when I'm prepping people in psychedelic for something that looks like holotropic breathwork that I do. Careful trademark talk there. I say anything that you can imagine could happen, and stuff that you can't even imagine could happen. And I give, 20 examples. Is that adequate? Maybe not. It's been serviceable and people haven't had a problem with it since I've been participating for, a very long time. So yeah, what do we do in psychedelia? I don't know. I think people have to cool their jets. I've seen people try to weaponize theology here. Oh, this doesn't work with my Christian theology, therefore it's bad. And I'm like, come on, guys, like get a grip. Grow up. This is medicine. Like, is it better to let that person suffer and die in a really horrible situation, or should we try to treat them and help them have a really good death, or chronic pain, or treatment-resistant depression, or whatever else? Like, is a mystical experience so bad? To like one of the peak possible human experiences, is it that bad? I don't think so. I think it's a massive benefit. Are you going to have what we call ontological shock? Totally. And you're going to have to deal with that. But is that worth the cost of your treatment and having the symptom that you've been suffering with for potentially 50 years sorted out? Is that worth ontological shock? I think yes. But people should know that there might be this sense. I think that's the term I prefer, Mason, is ontological shock. We did a really good episode with Erica Rex. And oh my God, I wish I could remember her name. And a very interesting therapist or psychologist from Southern California, and it was all about ontological shock and how important of a topic it is to dig into. And is it abuse? Like, in my opinion, fuck no. If someone claims it to be abuse, we should be questioning them.
Well,
that's where I land on it.
It has its origin in the Controlled Substances Act sort of view that anything that happens outside of controlled medical setting is considered abuse. It doesn't matter whether it's responsibly done or not. But in this case, it actually is being done in a medical setting. I think the worry there, and we wrote about this in this article, is that parts of those experiences may actually be essential to the benefit. We don't really know. I mean, that's another thing.
That's what the data's pointing to, right?
So, I don't know. I mean, I've heard, it would not surprise me if that was the case. I have read some data that suggests that. But I think to make either assumption, I mean, personally, I would not be surprised at all if just reading the narrative reports of people who have lost the desire to smoke or use cocaine, they describe the sort of subjective experience they went through that led to almost a revulsion of those substances. So I can see how it could be critical potentially to the benefit. And so by calling them abuse-related adverse events, you're kind of putting the cart before the horse. And we say at worst they should be called side effects because they are expected and they're common. I mean, this is a common thing, and usually they're mild and they don't last very long. But if we do uncover that they are essential to the therapeutic benefit, then we should just call them, not even call them side effects, just call them a part of the therapeutic mechanism. So it's and I think that the problem is during the informed consent process that you mentioned, if you say to someone, you may experience an abuse-related adverse event, like a mystical experience, or you might see, some image or a presence, that kind of primes people potentially to think, oh no, I'm having an adverse event, and could significantly affect the outcome.
So I think another big issue here too, and you're spot on there, is that the medical establishment is not ready to handle these kinds of conversations. Like they're so closed-minded, evidence-based only. And there's this whole field of transpersonal psychology that they're willfully ignoring, which has been working on this topic for many, many decades. And that to me is willful ignorance. And the therapists, doctors, et cetera, who are not spending time trying to understand this, you guys are kind of at fault. Like start studying this shit, read some Groff, read, the handbook of transpersonal psychology. So you have a bit of a handle on this topic. Not everything is going to come through, a really well-controlled CBT oriented study. God is still going to pop his head in once in a while, and you're going to have to deal with that. What's the way forward? I don't know. People need to really start having open conversations about this. One of my friends had a spontaneous non-drug mystical experience and was discussing this with a leader in one of the leading universities doing clinical trials, and they immediately chose to turn their big mystical experience into biographical content. Well, what does this have to do with your father or something? I'm like to me, that's one of the biggest affronts you could have as a professional, like interfacing with somebody that just had a mystical experience. Like, okay, so you just had the most valuable experience you could have happen to you, and this person's going to try to tell you it has to do with your father. Like the gigantic mismatch in worldview, theoretical frameworks, and everything. And yeah, we have to really do a lot of work to expand our models to understand how to deal with people as humans, meet them where they are at. If meeting somebody where they're at is important to these fields, then treating somebody like that is, to me, radically inappropriate. And and you're right, like setting the stage and calling it, you might have this traumatic thing, like it's a side effect. I think you're spot on. Like it's not, but it is also in some parts of the conversation a primary effect of psychedelics. Like if you're eating enough, this is probably going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's a complex conversation. People love to clickbait. The gentleman you mentioned earlier is pretty good at that. And I think we need to desensationalize and say, hey, we have decades of data that people aren't even touching because scientists are uncomfortable with the structure of the data because it's not double-blind RCT stuff. It's, legacy data. We need to get comfortable with that. And we need to learn from it. And if you're unwilling to learn from legacy data, you're a problem. You have to treat it as legacy data. It's not as robust as a repeated RCT, from 10 sites around the world. It's a different kind of data point, but it's still a really valuable data point.
Well, I completely agree with you. I think you don't want to make assumptions in either direction, but all information is valuable. But I do see a lot of hypocrisy in the space. For example, some people will demand incredibly high standards of evidence in some areas, but then they will accept very poor evidence to draw a conclusion. An example being the pilot that allegedly consumed psilocybin mushrooms. And I say allegedly because I don't know that there's any evidence that he actually did consume.
I've not seen any evidence.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that he's not being truthful, but we don't know. And of course, that's a whole complicated situation. But I have seen that weaponized in different ways by people to achieve certain ends, when really that situation probably doesn't really tell people a whole lot of anything because of so many unknowns in that particular situation. But I think just, having honest conversations is what it really comes down to, telling people that, we don't really know. This mystical experience you might have, it could be a very important part of the therapeutic process, or it might be kind of ancillary. We don't really know. But I think a lot of people do jump to conclusions, and being open-minded, like you said, and educating oneself. I'm constantly learning. You have to be about this. You could study for a lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And yes, it's important to be open-minded. It's important to be critical. You don't want to be so open-minded your brain falls out, but a little bit of open-mindedness is important here. And, just because you were trained in one way doesn't mean that is, the most pure representation of reality, right? Reality is quite complicated and strange. And we should respect that. Yeah. Cool. Did we hit enough for you?
Absolutely.
I hope we can do more.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. There's so much to talk about.
Right on. Well, Mason, thank you so much. Could you shout out your Substack and whatever else you're working on for a moment?
Yeah, so people can follow me on Twitter or X as Mason Marks MD. You can find me on LinkedIn, and then I have my free newsletter, Psychedelic Week, at psychedelicweek.com.
Outstanding. Well, Mason Marks, thanks so much for joining us, and I hope we can do more soon, as things are accelerating and we need help.
Yeah, it's fast. Thanks so much, Joe. Pleasure chatting with you. Good to see you, and hope to see you again soon.